New light. That is the name of the Jehovah's Witness doctrine of progressive revelation. But where does this new light come from? And does it even make sense? That's what I'll be speaking about today on this week's episode of the Jexit podcast. Hello and welcome to the Jexit podcast. My name is Riley, a former Jehovah's Witness who left the religion in 2019. Before we start today's episode, I just want to apologize for the way my voice sounds right now. I have a really bad cold and it's just making my voice sound really terrible. So my apologies. So, new light. This is something I've spoken about many times on my YouTube channel, because it's a topic that I feel extremely passionate about. Doing a deep dive into New Light and what it actually meant for the religion and for my belief in it is one of the things that actually woke me up from my JW indoctrination. Of all the Jehovah's Witness doctrines, I think New Light is one of the easiest, if not the easiest thing to debunk. It doesn't take an awful lot of analysis to realize that it just really doesn't make any sense. It's also something that I call a self-defeating doctrine. The governing body, who are the leaders of the Jehovah's Witness religion, claim that they have been appointed by none other than Jesus himself in the year 1919 to be the sole channel of communication between Almighty God and human beings. But New Light, which is supposed to support this claim, actually undermines it, and we're going to speak about that a little bit later. But first, let's define New Light and see where this doctrine comes from in the first place. So, New Light is what the Jehovah's Witnesses call their doctrine of progressive revelation. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses aren't the only religion to have this doctrine. Off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure that the Seventh-day Adventists, and I know for a fact that the Mormon religions also have this doctrine of progressive revelation. Now, the idea of progressive revelation is that God reveals his truth on a gradual basis. He doesn't tell his prophets or his spokespeople everything all at once. He reveals it to them gradually as time goes on. And New Light is what Jehovah's Witnesses call this process. Now, where did they get this name, New Light, from? It actually comes from a scripture in the book of Proverbs, chapter 4 and verse 18, which says, "But the path of the righteous is like the bright morning light that grows brighter and brighter until full daylight." Some very poetic words there. Now, the way Jehovah's Witnesses understand this scripture is by means of a metaphor. They believe that light is being used metaphorically in this verse to represent information that is revealed from Jehovah, specifically information about the Bible and its overall message. So since the scripture indicates that light gets brighter and brighter as time goes on, they understand that metaphorically to mean that the message of the Bible becomes clearer and clearer as time goes on. Now, straight away here, we have a problem. If you take that verse in isolation, it's very easy to make that claim that this verse is a metaphor for progressive revelation. Now, straight away here, we have a problem. If you read that verse in isolation, it's very easy to make the claim that this verse is a metaphor for progressive revelation. The verse does indeed use metaphorical language. But if you read the verse in its proper context, in fact, if you read the entire chapter 4 of the book of Proverbs, there is nothing in that chapter whatsoever that indicates the verse should be taken in this way. This passage of scripture, and please feel free to read it in your own time if you're so inclined, is basically a father giving some life advice to his son and using very poetic and metaphorical language to make his point. So the way JWs take this scripture is completely arbitrary. And this is actually a good example of one of the problems that I have with the Bible in general. It is so incredibly easy to take random verses in isolation from the Bible and then build entire narratives around them and then feel that you're justified in doing so. For example, did you know that there is a religion called snake handling? Yes, there is a denomination of Christianity that practices the handling of venomous snakes. This is what the Wikipedia article has to say about them. Snake handling, also called serpent handling, is a religious rite observed in a small number of isolated churches, mostly in the United States, usually characterized as rural and part of the holiness movement. The practice began in the early 20th century in Appalachia and plays only a small part in the church service. Participants are holiness or Pentecostals. The beliefs and practices of the movement have been documented in several films and have been the impetus for a number of state laws related to the handling of venomous animals. Now, the Christian churches who practice this ritualistic snake handling actually have scriptures to back up the practice. One of them is Luke chapter 10, verse 19, which says, "Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." So the implication is that if you're able to handle venomous snakes and suffer no harm, then it shows that you are in some way chosen by God because he has given you this power. Now, if you thought that that was a bizarre example, just wait until you hear this next one. And this example comes from right here in the United Kingdom. It is called the ICF. That is the International Church of Football, believe it or not. This is a religion based around the sport of football or soccer if you're in the United States. And they base their core doctrine around this scripture in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 14, which says, "I am pressing on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God by means of Jesus Christ." Who would have known that the act of scoring a goal and receiving a prize was such a holy endeavor? I certainly didn't. But I have a confession to make. That second example was completely made up. There is no such religion as the ICF, the International Church of Football. It is completely fictitious. But I did that on purpose just to show you how easy it is to take scriptures out of context and build a whole narrative around it. And the Jehovah's Witness religion does this all the time. Now, going back to Proverbs chapter 4, as I said, this is just an account of a man giving some life advice to his son. Whether or not that actually took place in real life, in history, is another matter entirely. But all it is advice. That man telling his son that the path of the righteous is like the morning light that gets brighter. He may as well have said to his son, "Son, life is like a box of chocolates." And it really is as simple as that. That's all it is. It's certainly nothing to base a whole religious doctrine around. But nevertheless, that is what the leaders of the JW religion have done. Now, let's talk about whether or not this doctrine of progressive revelation, or new light as they like to call it, makes any sense at all. Now, this is how new light is supposed to work. When Jehovah, in his infinite wisdom, has decided that the time is now right for his people on earth to understand a particular thing in the Bible, he relays that message to his son Jesus, who then relays that message to the governing body, who are the faithful and discreet slave, who then relay that message to Jehovah's Witnesses around the world. And then through their preaching and evangelizing work, Jehovah's Witnesses relay that message to humankind worldwide. So through that process, you can see that there is a clear channel of communication coming directly from Jehovah to human beings. That being the case, you'd assume that the messages that come through this channel directly from Jehovah would always be clear and correct, wouldn't you? Well, if you would, you'd be wrong, because these messages are anything but clear and more often than not incorrect. There are even many examples of new light contradicting itself. One of my favorite examples of this happening is relating to organ transplants. Now, I'm just going to read you a short excerpt from the JW Facts website. If you've never been to that website before, please visit it if you're so inclined. It is an excellent and extremely comprehensive resource to JW doctrine and how it has changed over the years. This is what it has to say about organ transplants. Watchtower teachings on medical advice have varied wildly over the years. Organ transplants is one of these areas. Over the years, a Jehovah's Witness could have a transplant, could not have a transplant and risk being disfellowshipped if they had one, and could have a transplant. Now, the article on the website goes into great detail to show how that doctrine has flip-flopped over the years, but I'll just give you a brief summary. According to the December 22nd, 1949 issue of the Wake magazine, organ transplants were acceptable. It then changed in 1967 in the November 15th Watchtower magazine to being unacceptable. It then changed back to acceptable again in 1980, according to the March 15th issue of the Watchtower magazine. Now, bear in mind, each time that the governing body receives this new light, they pitch it as coming directly from Jehovah. If I remember rightly, there's even a recent clip from governing body member Samuel Hurd on JW Broadcasting where he's saying, "This isn't from us, this comes from Jehovah." He wasn't speaking about organ transplants specifically in that clip, but he was making the point that when the governing body receives new light, it's not their own ideas. So if this new light is coming from Jehovah each and every time, is Jehovah changing his mind? Is it the case that Jehovah can't make up his mind whether organ donations are acceptable for Jehovah's Witnesses or not? Now, if you were to ask any Jehovah's Witness as to whether or not Jehovah's standards change, they would immediately tell you, no, they do not. Jehovah's standards for right and wrong do not change, let alone change one way and then change back again. So then how do you explain this phenomenon of the organ transplants, the doctrinal flip-flopping? How do you explain it? Now, as far as I can fathom, there are only 3 possible explanations that fit all of the circumstances. Explanation number 1. Jehovah does change his mind and he's leading the governing body on a merry dance. Explanation number 2. Jehovah isn't changing his mind, but the governing body aren't getting the message. They are somehow interpreting Jehovah's messages incorrectly and therefore making mistakes. Or explanation number 3. Jehovah isn't sending them any messages whatsoever. This is just all their own ideas. If you can think of any additional explanations that fit all of the circumstances, please let me know, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and I can't come up with any other than those 3. But if you're a faithful and believing Jehovah's Witness, neither of those 3 explanations is ideal for your faith. Regardless of whichever one of those explanations is true, the implications for the truthfulness of your religion is huge. Let's look at a more recent example of new light. In November of last year, 2023, it was announced that publishers in the congregation will no longer be required to submit how long they spent in the ministry. Up until that point, every month, publishers in the Jehovah's Witness religion would have to submit a report detailing how much time they spent evangelizing. And not just that, they would also have to record how many magazines they distributed, how many books, how many times they've showed a video to someone. All of this information went on a report which they would submit to the congregation. But in November, this requirement was cancelled. And the reason they gave for this was that there's no scriptural basis for having such a requirement. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses will be very quick to tell you that everything they do and believe is based on the Bible. And I believed exactly the same thing when I was a Jehovah's Witness. But when the governing body cancelled the requirement to submit ministry reports, they were basically admitting that all of this time they've been doing something that wasn't based on the Bible. So Jehovah's Witnesses base all of their beliefs on the Bible, except when they don't. The two things can't be true. Now, surprisingly, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses do address the fact that their doctrines change from time to time, and sometimes they've made mistakes. However, they don't call them mistakes. They call them clarifications, which, if you ask me, is a complete misnomer. A clarification is when new information makes previous information clearer or more understandable. If new information makes the previous information completely wrong or even the opposite, then that is actually a correction, not a clarification. The governing body tries to avoid responsibility for misleading its members by framing these mistakes and corrections as clarifications. But it's not too difficult to see the situation for what it really is, especially when you take into account this little gem, which can be found in the February study edition of the Watchtower magazine from 2017, under the article, Who is Leading God's People Today? In paragraph 12 of that article, it says, the governing body is neither inspired nor infallible. Therefore, it can err in doctrinal matters or in organizational direction. Now, on the surface, this paragraph seems like an act of humility. It seems like the governing body is holding up their hands and saying, we're not perfect, we can make mistakes. In any other situation, you'd probably appreciate a person being that honest with you. Nobody likes someone who always thinks they're right and never wants to take responsibility for their mistakes. But most people don't claim to be handpicked by Jesus as the sole channel of communication between God and humans. And most people don't claim that when they give you new instructions or new updates to their doctrine, that it's coming directly from God himself. Those details make all the difference. When it comes to interpreting the Bible and interpreting God's message, if you believe that the Bible is God's inspired word, if the members of the governing body can make mistakes in that process, how are they different from anyone else? This status of being the faithful and discreet slave makes no difference. What is the point of being identified as this special class of servant of Jehovah, the faithful and discreet slave, responsible for dispensing the truth of the Bible, if they're going to make the same mistakes that anyone else would? How can they claim to be speaking directly for Jehovah God if they can't make up their minds about what they're actually saying? There is absolutely no way to square that circle. There's no logic to this because it doesn't make any sense. Besides the fact that this doctrine is completely nonsensical, what's even more egregious is the fact that you can get disfellowshipped for apostasy for disagreeing with what they teach. They freely admit that they can make doctrinal mistakes, but at the same time, they want you to believe that everything they teach comes from Jehovah, and if you disagree with it, you'll be removed from the congregation and cut off from your friends and family. How in good conscience can you do that to someone for disagreeing with a teaching that might be a mistake. There are people who have been disfellowshipped for having past ideas that are now present doctrine. That's how ridiculous it is. Let's rewind back to November 2023, before they made the announcement that you no longer needed to submit your field service report. Now, for years, there have been Jehovah's Witnesses who have been saying that the requirement to submit a report is not biblical. And many of those people were disfellowshipped for going against the direction from the governing body. Now, imagine, for the sake of argument, and I want to be very clear on this is completely hypothetical what I'm saying, but imagine the last person to be disfellowshipped for that reason was disfellowshipped the day before they made that announcement. So you have a member of the congregation who has read their Bible thoroughly and can clearly see that there is no scripture in the Bible that supports submitting your field service report. They get disfellowshipped because of this opinion, and then the very next day, the governing body themselves cancel that requirement on the grounds that it's not biblical. How ridiculous a situation is that? Now, I have no idea whether or not anybody was actually disfellowshipped for this the day before the announcement was made. But make no mistake, people have been disfellowshipped for this reason. Will they receive an apology? Will they have their sentences commuted or their convictions vacated? Of course they won't. Make it make sense. Now, I've had just about all I can stomach of New Light for this week's episode of the Jexit podcast. But if you're an active and faithful Jehovah's Witness who is listening to this, first of all, thank you very much. I know firsthand how scary it is listening to quote unquote apostate information. So I applaud your courage and open-mindedness. But I would like to leave you with this question. Is it reasonable to believe that an all-knowing, loving, and just God would preside over such a shambles? And that is it for this week's episode of the Jexit podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, share, comment, and also subscribe so that you're alerted each time a new episode is posted. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great week.